What is perfectionism? I think we've all heard the term a million times. We've heard, don't be such a perfectionist. We may even have heard, don't be such a control freak. And indeed, there was the Monk show. What was the name of that show? Talking about, quote, OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And yet we hear some people say, well, I don't really have a problem with anything because if you were to call me a perfectionist, well, in these days you have to have high standards or your work won't be accepted. So I have great attention to detail. But here are a few thoughts of mine concerning this topic of, quote, perfectionism. First, you can buy scads of books, so to speak, on perfectionism, and they will run into the hundreds of pages. But do they get to the nub of it, the essence, the bullseye on it, and in short order, like in one page? I hope to attempt to address this in one page, so to speak. Otherwise, we have what you might call a bunch of gobbledygook. Well, first I would say, life is complex, surely. People are like rocket science in terms of the topic matter, I believe, for instance. But does that mean we should be constantly focused on details and the complexity? Or should we simply let our minds run unfettered at times to get in, quote, the big picture? Kind of like the phrase, be still and know that I am God, that having special meaning for those who are of a particular religion, say. Or, don't just do something, sit there. Both implying to me, in part, don't focus all the time exclusively on a bunch of details to the exclusion, then, of the big picture. Kind of like the phrase, not being able to see the forest for the trees of details. This then going round and round, too, on the topic of science versus intuition, or facts versus intuition. The whole topic of intuition, which in my mind is simply a period of time in which one's mind is not focused so heavily on a bunch of details to the exclusion of the big picture. The big picture coming into focus when we let our minds just run free, so to speak, whatever pops into our mind, and we call this perhaps intuition, what we get as a result. Yes, not laden, not full of a bunch of details, but far richer and applicable at times in terms of the overall picture. And I believe we need both, and we need to be able to shift back and forth. One only is not enough. We need complexity at times, hence details, and big picture thinking at other times. The bird's eye view, call it. Now, I think an unaddressed issue when we talk perfectionism, though, is not to discuss the merits of details or complexity management, or even how often to do so, all the time, none of the time, part of the time, but rather a different concept entirely. I believe the derogatory or negative part of focusing on details can happen if we focus on complexity or details or avoidance of anything to avoid a catastrophe, or so we say in our minds. As opposed alternatively to focusing on details or complexity to improve our lives as per joy, as per the finishing touches, as per the icing on the cake, once the cake has been, so to speak, rid of a lot of pain points inside. Namely, what we catastrophize, what drives us to terror feelings, and of course to anger feelings, or on one high end of the spectrum, rage feelings. So thus you might say, we can pursue complexity through management of details. And you can call this trying to perfect things in general, trying to improve them. But what are we trying to improve? What are we trying to perfect? That we not have some kind of catastrophe that we think could happen? Or have we gotten to the point where we have relatively few things that trigger us into a mode of panic, a mode of thinking everything could go to, quote, hell in a handbasket and be a catastrophe thus? Are we at that point then where we can say, I feel pretty safe and secure, and now I can put the finishing touches to bring extra joy to my life and others? I think at this point then, focusing on details at times, or perfecting, is not the typical concept involved in perfectionism, but it is iterative improvement. Knowing, of course, you can't be ever at the 100.0% mark, or we would all be in La La Land, nirvana, and we would all be, quote, gods or goddesses. But at any rate, are we trying to do iterative improvement, grow, to avoid a catastrophe happening? Or are we growing because we don't have much of the fear of any of that anymore, and anger, but especially the catastrophe aspect? And then we can just move on to putting things up a notch or two or three in terms of adding to the spice of life, rather than constantly what you might call putting out fires or avoiding fires, so to speak, in life. Are we thus danger-oriented and danger management-oriented, with focus at times on details and iterative improvement in general, complexity management? Or have we gone beyond that point, such that we, again, are putting the icing on the cake to add more and more happiness and joy, above the mediocre even, that might be otherwise simply from putting pain points into the background, these pain points being called what we catastrophize at times, what we most fear. For isn't even the, quote, troublesome person in our life, the ogre, quite amenable, quite happy, quite supportive of us during those times when they feel safe and secure, even if that's not very often? I'd posit that during those times they are not subject to much catastrophizing in terms of thinking, in terms of all of that in their minds. And so they are liberated thus to feel happiness that they typically might not feel. And so we can be in two modes, I believe. Crisis management, or as I would say, catastrophe avoidance, or we can be in the mode of growth of joy, growth of happiness, in which we are at a certain point where our basic safety needs, our basic feelings of something not dreadful around the corner happening, have been attained, but not necessarily materially or financially, but emotionally speaking, and even verbally speaking. For our words can often drive us to catastrophize something right there. Hence the phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous, perhaps, stinking thinking being a problem. And I'd say then, too, the concept even of paranoia could likely be a matter of catastrophizing some one thing or more, as opposed to simply regarding it as a nuisance or a discomfort. For you can even take having cancer, for instance, and reframe it not as a catastrophe, but simply a discomfort or reality of life. It's not like it's going to last 10 trillion years and of the same intensity. It has a limited duration and time span. I think that we often tend to forget when we consider something perhaps a catastrophe and try and manage it away, shall we say, with so-called perfectionism. Yes, it's wonderful to improve joy, happiness in ourselves and others. But if we are doing it in the service of avoiding something horrific rather than improving what is already quite acceptable, I think that's the difference between calling detail focus at times perfectionism versus something completely different. And I don't know really that we have a word for using focus on details to our advantage, not to stomp out fires that we think could happen very soon. My thoughts then on perfectionism. Yes, perfectionism in terms of trying to grow, focusing on details but only sometimes. But perfectionism in the negative sense, if it is in the service of avoiding something we are horrified could happen, as opposed to trying to refine something constantly, perfect it more and more, so that we have more and more happiness once we don't fear something horrific happening.